Hello and welcome. My name is Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video, I want to talk about realism and anti-realism. Now, if you came here to get a good, clear, crisp definition of realism and of anti-realism, then you are in the wrong place. But you're in the wrong place not because this is in particular the wrong place and there are other better places out there. You're in the wrong place because there is no right place. Nobody can give you a clear, crisp definition of realism and anti-realism because these terms are used in so many different ways in philosophy. There are so many discussions where people talk about realism and anti-realism, and they mean sometimes completely different things with them. So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to expose, explore, explain some of the most important meanings of realism and anti-realism in philosophy in order to give you a bit of a guide and a bit of a feel for what those terms can mean. In particular, I will be talking first about the use of realism and anti-realism to talk about whether one accepts or does not accept the existence of certain things. Then I'm going to take a foray into questions about what is called scientific realism. And finally, I'll talk about what I like to think of as a sort of most metaphysical kind of realism, which has to do with the dependence or independence of the world on us. All right, so let's start with the first, let's say, type of realism, which has to do with the existence or non-existence of certain things, in a very broad sense of thing. So suppose that somebody comes to me and says, well, do you believe in moral values? I might say that I believe in moral values, and they might say that they don't believe in moral values. And then one of the possibilities, it's not the only possibility as we'll see later, but one of the possibilities is that I think that moral values actually exist, and they think that moral values just don't exist. There's just no such thing as moral value. So I think that going around in the street murdering people is evil or bad, and they think that murdering people out in the street is murdering people out in the street. And you can't say that it's good or evil because those terms never apply to anything. There's no such thing in the world, or there's just no such thing, period, as good or evil, good or bad, as sort of a correct application of moral terms. So that's one possibility. And this person who denies the reality of morality, and so is an anti-realist about morality, might have a lot of different reasons for that. Right? So they might say something like, well, you know, all that there is physics. And when I look at physics and physical particles and so on, I just can't find any place for morality in the world. And so it doesn't exist. And so there's no such thing as the moral value of an action. I mean, that's one of the arguments they could make. And that would be then an argument in favor of an anti-realism in the sense that it just denies the existence of something. Right? So this person just denies the existence of moral value, not a term that ever applies to anything, whereas I might accept the existence of moral value. I think it's a term that does apply to certain things. So I would be a realist and they would be an anti-realist. And of course, you can have a lot of versions of realism and anti-realism in this sense, namely about, you know, everything that could exist or not exist. Right? You could be a realist or an anti-realist about aesthetic value, about beauty. You could be a realist or an anti-realist even about very particular things. You could be a realist or an anti-realist about the monster of Loch Ness, I suppose, where the realist says that it exists and the anti-realist says that it doesn't exist. That's not a philosophical stance, but it will be sort of applying the terms with the same meaning. Right? Does it exist or does it not exist? Realism versus anti-realism. So that is an important way of using these terms in philosophy. And when people, for instance, say that they are realists about morality or anti-realists about morality, or that they are realists about sets of numbers or anti-realists about sets of numbers, this might be what they mean. Might. They might also mean something else, but this might be what they mean. They accept the existence or they don't. All right. Now what I want to do is I want to get a sense of how much more complicated the use of these terms can be by delving into one of the main debates of late 20th century philosophy of science. So some people are still having this debate. It's not like finished, or we all know what the answer is, but there was a lot of attention to it in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s maybe. It's the debate on scientific realism. So what is scientific realism? Well, it has to do with scientific theories that postulate entities that we don't just, observe in daily life. So a scientific theory is about penguins and fish. That's not really the kind of theory that generates questions about scientific realism, because penguins and fish, we all know that they exist. We all know what kind of stance to take towards them. It's not like there's no philosophical complication there that is like special for science. But things might be a bit different if this is a theory that talks about, let's say, electrons. Right? You don't just see electrons when you walk around the world, but now you meet these physicists and they talk about electrons, and they might say things like there are electrons. And now we have to wonder about how to deal with that kind of scientific theory. Right? Should we believe in electrons? What does it exactly mean to believe in electrons? So some people here defend what has become known as scientific realism. And there's a very famous definition of scientific realism by Bas van Fraassen in his book, The Scientific Image. And Bas van Fraassen is not a scientific realist, but he gives a definition of scientific realism in order to argue against it. And according to van Fraassen, a scientific realist is somebody who believes this. They believe that the aim of science is to give us literally true theories of the world, and that accepting such a theory means believing that it is true. So there's a couple of elements there. So I'll repeat it and then I'll zoom in on these elements. So a scientific realist is somebody who believes that the aim of science is to give us literally true theories of the world, and that accepting a scientific theory means believing it to be true. So there's first a story about the aim of science. So if I think that the aim of science is not even to really sort of tell me a true story about reality, but the aim of science is just to give us technology, for instance. Suppose that I believe that. The aim of science is to just give us technology. Well, then I wouldn't be a scientific realist in the sense of van Fraassen. Right, so now we're not talking about whether something exists or not. Now we're talking about aims. Well, we're talking about what we want from science. What do scientists aim at? What is success in science? Well, if you think it's just pragmatic, then you're already not a realist in this sense of the word. Okay, the second part of the definition tells us that the aim of science is to give us literally true theories of the world. And that word literally is very important, because there have been a whole school of philosophers, basically the logical positivists, who said, oh yeah, it's fine that scientists talk about electrons and genes and, black holes and energy mass tensors and all these things that maybe you can't really observe. But really what it is just a shorthand for talking about very complex observations. So when scientists say electron, what they really mean is some very complicated statement about what you will measure in the laboratory. And so according to this kind of positivist interpretation of science, when scientists are talking about supposedly unobservable things, that's actually not what they're doing. Like literally, they are just talking about observations, and there's no question about whether those exist, right? And so if you think that science never actually really talks about unobservable entities, then you're not a scientific realist, according to van Fraassen. Right? So a scientific realist is somebody who thinks that scientists aim to give us theories that are true about the world in a literal sense. When they talk about electrons, they really mean electrons. And then the final part of the definition is that accepting a theory means believing it to be true. So if I accept a theory of electrons, I believe that it's true. And so a scientific realist would be somebody who thinks that the aim of science is to give us theories that really describe the world using terms like electron, and that when we get confident in science, maybe we're not yet confident, but when we get confident in science, we will believe these stories to be literally true. And Van Fraassen himself is going to say, no, I don't believe in that last part. I think that accepting a theory just means believing that it's going to give you the right predictions for your observations. So he thinks that, yeah, you know, the theory of electrons is really about electrons, but I don't need to believe it. I just need to believe that it gives me the right answers when I predict what I'm going to see in the world. But the realist is somebody who believes then that I, as a scientist, am looking for a literally true story of the world that I can believe in, right? That I really end up believing that the world consists of electrons, black holes, energy, mass, tensors, and who knows what else. So that's the story of scientific realism versus scientific anti-realism. And here we can see that realism is much more than just accepting that something exists, right? In fact, it's also less. A scientific realist doesn't have to believe that there are electrons because maybe they're not confident about that theory, right? Maybe they think that scientists need to do more work. But the scientific realist is somebody who has a particular picture of enquiry. They believe that enquiry, scientific enquiry, is about getting to the point where I believe things about the world, including things about unobservables like electrons, which I can't just see with my naked eye. That's what science is all about. So this is a much more complicated picture of realism and anti-realism. And if you read the scientific realism debates with the less complicated, more simple picture of existence versus non-existence in the back of your mind, it's going to make no sense at all. Whereas, of course, if you do the opposite, if you have this scientific realism picture and then you look at, let's say, a debate about moral realism, it also doesn't make any sense, right? Nobody believes that there are scientists out there making up like theories where moral values are the unobservables and they use them to explain and predict the world. And now, I mean, we're not talking about a scientific theory there. So, very different ways of talking about realism and anti-realism in these different debates in philosophy. And that gets me to the final kind of realism and anti-realism that I want to talk about, which is a kind of realism and anti-realism that basically has to do with the relation between reality and us. And I like to explain this by first thinking about mathematics. So suppose that somebody thinks about the numbers, right? All the numbers, and we can have all kinds of hypotheses and theories about the numbers. And one of these hypotheses is the twin prime conjecture. And the twin prime conjecture says that, well, sometimes you've got two prime numbers that are only 2 apart, like 3 and 5, they're only 2 apart. Or 11 and 13, they're only 2 apart. And if we keep thinking 29 and 31, they're only 2 apart. So here's the twin prime conjecture. It's the claim that there are infinitely many of such pairs, of such twins. This twin prime conjecture has not been proven to be true, and it has not been proven to be false. Okay. Now, suppose that I am a realist about mathematics, in the sense of realism that I'm talking about now, right? This third, like most metaphysical maybe, sense of realism. If I'm a realist about mathematics, then what I believe is that mathematics, like the entities of mathematics, the stuff that my mathematical statements are about, is independent of us and our ways of inquiry. And so what I'm going to have to believe basically about these twin primes is, well, maybe there are infinitely many of them, and maybe there are not infinitely many of them. One of the two has to be the case, independently of whether we will ever be able to find out. Right? Maybe we'll never be able to find out. Maybe our inquiry is never going to allow us to prove the twin prime conjecture. It's never going to allow us to disprove the twin prime conjecture. Well, never mind. because our inquiry has nothing to do, is not relevant for the reality of the numbers themselves. And so in the reality of the numbers themselves, there is going to be either infinitely many twin primes or not. So here, realism is the idea that the reality that we are investigating is independent of our investigation. And so the truth of the twin prime conjecture has nothing to do with whether we can prove it or not. Right? I mean, maybe we can't prove it and we can't disprove it. It's still going to be true or false because independently of inquiry, there is this realm of mathematical numbers that is real. Whereas the anti-realist is going to say, no, look, mathematics does not exist independently of us and our ways of inquiry. A mathematical statement is true if we can prove it. It's false if we can disprove it. If we can do neither, it has no truth value. That's one of the things that the anti-realist could say. If we can't prove the twin prime conjecture and we can't disprove it, then there's just nothing there. Because there are no mathematical truths, there is no mathematical reality apart from our practices of defining mathematical entities, talking about them and proving things about them. So that would be an anti-realist view. Right? You're an anti-realist about mathematics, not because you think that it doesn't exist or that it's not real, but you think that its reality depends on us and our ways of inquiry. And so truths about the numbers exist if and only if we can prove them. Maybe not we today, right? But we, in a sort of, if we kept doing mathematics as long as possible and as well as possible, but if we pushed our practices of mathematics to, further and further and further, anything that we can prove then at some point in the development of mathematics, well, that's true. Anything that we can disprove at some point in the development of mathematics, well, that's false. And anything that we never reach isn't there, right? There is no, suppose that we can never prove or disprove the twin prime conjecture, then it's also neither true nor false. You shouldn't think of the numbers as being there irrespective of us and our investigations and having sort of properties that maybe we can never reach. All right, so here realism and anti-realism has something to do with the relation between reality and ourselves, and in particular the dependence or independence of that reality on us. My own favorite example of this kind of anti-realism would be the transcendental idealism of Immanuel Kant. So Kant is basically telling us something like the story I just gave you about mathematics, but then for the physical universe. Right? According to Kant, what is real about the physical universe, so the universe of real objects, is just what we can reach in inquiry. And what we can't reach in inquiry isn't real. And again, we have to think about this in a very ideal way. If we keep on investigating, if we were like the best possible finite thinkers and inquirers that there could be, like we spend all our time, energy, ingenuity and so on, like maybe even being more intelligent and more resourceful than we actually are, but still, finite beings in space and time in this world. That kind of inquiry is what gets to reality, because reality is what that kind of inquiry gets to. Right? There's no reality independent of inquiry. What Kant doesn't mean is that if you believe something, it's true. Right? If you do some inquiry and you come to the conclusion that the dinosaurs went extinct 200 years ago, you're wrong. Right? Having a false belief is possible. Believing something doesn't make it true. It's false because better inquiry would show you that the dinosaurs became extinct more like, 65 billion years ago? No, 65 million years ago, of course. Something like that, right? So inquiry, if pushed to the limit, would reveal reality, because reality is just what you reveal through human finite inquiry. And so for Kant, there can't be any sort of hidden truths about the world. Truths that we could never find out about, because such a thing couldn't be a truth. So that kind of anti-realism is supposed to be a fairly radical answer to skepticism. Right? If you have something like Descartes' skepticism, which of course he's not a skeptic himself, but he posits a kind of skepticism where you worry about whether the world is even real, and maybe even your best investigations can't sort of tell you whether the world is real. And so there's this gap between reality and investigation, where even the best investigation maybe doesn't get to reality. That is the picture that requires realism, because that requires realism in the sense that there is a reality independent of inquiry. Whereas in Kant's story, this is just not possible. There can't be a reality that we don't reveal through investigation, because investigation is by definition what gets us to reality, because reality is by definition that which investigation leads to. Right? These two things are so entwined that you can't pull them apart. So this third type of realism and anti-realism has to do with the relation between reality and inquiry. And according to the realist, there is a reality independent of inquiry, which has sort of an existence of its own, independent of us and our ways of thinking and our ways of trying to find out about the world. Whereas for the anti-realist, reality and inquiry are sort of two sides of the same thing. You can't have one without the other. And there couldn't be a reality that inquiry can never reach. Philosophically speaking, that might be the most fundamental kind of realism versus anti-realism debate. Although, of course, all the other discussions are also very important discussions in philosophy, and we definitely also want to know whether moral value is real, or whether there's no moral value, for instance. But it's really important to know about these different kinds of realism versus anti-realism, because otherwise you are continually going to get into confusion. So if somebody tells you, oh, I believe that moral value is real, as I said at the very beginning of this video, what they might mean is just the first type of realism. That's what I meant at the beginning of this video. I don't think that it's always wrong, always false to claim that something is good or evil. I think it's sometimes right to claim that something is good or evil. And so I don't deny the existence of good and evil. But that doesn't mean, and now we get to the third type of realism and anti-realism, that doesn't mean that I think that good and evil exist independently of us and our ways of thinking about the world. On the contrary, in that sense, I'm an anti-realist about morality, and I think that there absolutely is no sense in talking about good or evil or good or bad, whatever you want, independently of us and the way that we are constituted as rational beings and so on and so forth. So I don't think that good and evil are sort of independent of us in any sense. And if you don't keep these different ways of talking about realism and anti-realism apart, you are going to continually and all the time misunderstand other writers or other people that you talk to while doing philosophy. So, very important to know about these different ways in which realism and anti-realism are used. There are more than I've talked about, so you always have to keep your eyes open and really think and really read or listen or ask more questions when people are talking about things that exist or don't exist, are real or not real, and so on and so forth. What exactly do they mean?